Hello, Burrell. Can you hear me?
I can indeed. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear.
Good.
So, welcome to the Waters workshop. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation to present. Professor Burrell Montz, she is a professor in the Department of Geography, Planning, and Environment at East Carolina University. So now we are in more or less in this continent. Okay, a bit up north, but still on this side of the hemisphere. So she's a coordinator of ECU's Natural Resources and Environment Research Cluster. She received her BA from Mary Washington College. Her MS is from Oklahoma State University, and her PhD is from the University of Colorado. Her academic record includes 11 books and edited monographs. So any questions about publishing, go for it. And then, yes, and over 80 research papers and proceedings, a dozen book chapters, and 40 grants for research. So I'm sure it's now continuing to increase. This must be an old data. So, okay, so, and then her research has documented the effects of flooding on property values. Actually, she's, I would say when I started doing my research, one of my first references was from her publication. And when I met her first time in Leeds, I was so overwhelmed to see her. I was like, oh my God, Burrell is here. So I was very happy to meet her. She has research on perceptions of risk and responses to warnings, sources and management options for water pollution, and vulnerability of communities. She works very closely with communities. Her recent work centers on the efficacy of National Weather Service products for various audiences. So I will leave the floor to Burrell for her presentation. Burrell, could you please share your screen with us?
I just did. Can you see it?
No, it's not showing. Can you do it again?
Start sharing.
Yeah, okay, it's, yeah. Now
That
we can,
work?
yes, we can see it, yes.
Good. All right, there's an echo. What do I need to do to get rid of the echo?
Oh, what happened here? Skype? Oh, okay, it's fine. Oh, right. Good, yes, we can see it very nice here. Okay.
Okay, good. Good, good.
Mm.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. One of the keys to being having the publication record I do is just being around for a very long time. So just keep going, that's the key. Well, it is a delight to meet with everybody, at least virtually, and I hope that my presentation is helpful to you as you work through this workshop. The program looks wonderful. I'm really impressed, Namrata, with what you put together. So what I'm going to be talking about is some hurricanes and the flooding that went along with those hurricanes in two communities that have experienced repeat losses. And so I want to talk a little bit about the events, the perceptions that the communities had of those events, and the vulnerabilities of those communities. So I'm trying to figure out how to make there. So the goals of my presentation, first of all, are to understand the complexities of flood management in small towns. The communities that I'll be looking at are particularly hazardous areas, and as a result, they're at increasing risk to climate change. And some of the events that we've seen recently suggest the significance of the events to climate change, or the climate change to the events. And I think that these events and the communities that I'll be looking at allow us to look at opportunities for developing resilience despite high physical and socioeconomic vulnerability. And the two communities that I'll be talking about are in eastern North Carolina, which is a very poor region of the state. And these communities are particularly not well off, as you'll see as I go through the presentation. So that's what I hope to get across today. I like to put any kind of talk into kind of a theoretical perspective, and I'm particularly fond of this diagram by Tom Birkeland, who was trying to get at how we might learn from past events, and in particular where we get learning and where we don't get learning. So as we often know, an event often opens what we call a policy window. And that then we would assume or hope would put the event and the impacts of that event on the political agenda. If it doesn't, well, then we don't learn anything. But more often it does. But the key then to following through and actually learning from the event is to have some kind of group mobilization that pushes forward some ideas that are discussed. And those ideas then lead to policies being adopted. And then, as you can see, it feeds back into the accumulated experience from prior events. So what I want to focus on today is these events that happened one after another, although each community had quite different experiences, and see where we learned and perhaps where we didn't learn from those events. So the events, I'm going to be looking at Hurricane Matthew, which, as you can see, occurred in October 2016, Hurricane Florence just under 2 years later, and Hurricane Michael just about a month after Hurricane Florence. And the two communities that I'm looking at are Lumberton, North Carolina, which is in the southern part of the state, and Windsor, North Carolina, which is in the northeastern part of the state. And again, these are particularly vulnerable communities because of their locations, very low-lying areas, not a lot of relief, and particularly in the case of Windsor, it's close to the coast, so there are tidal effects that affect the river that goes through Windsor, which makes it difficult for the water to run out. So let's look first at the events. Hurricane Matthew is in the upper right of the screen, and it approached North Carolina from for some reason there's a timer on this. It approached North Carolina from a generally eastern position across the Atlantic. Hurricane Florence came from the southeast, and then Michael actually came from the Gulf of Mexico, and you'll see that. So that had a very different track than Florence or Matthew, and it also had very different impacts. So here's Hurricane Matthew. If you follow the track, it came up and made landfall on the South Carolina coast, just south of North Carolina, on October 8th, and you can see that in the upper diagram. On the lower diagram, this shows notable one-day rainfall, and Lumberton is in the lower left-hand side, center left-hand side, and Lumberton experienced in Matthew about 315 millimeters of one-day rainfall, which was a record. Windsor isn't on the map, but it experienced about 200 millimeters of rainfall in one day, which was close to a record, but not a record in Windsor. But again, we're talking about record-breaking or near record-breaking rainfall in Hurricane Matthew. Hurricane Florence, you can see a little bit different track for Hurricane Florence. It made landfall just over the North Carolina-South Carolina border in Wrightsville Beach, North Carolina. The precipitation map on bottom shows the overall precipitation for the event. During the event, Lumberton experienced about 600 millimeters of rainfall, and Windsor experienced only about 100 millimeters of rainfall. And not surprisingly, as you'll find out, Windsor was hardly affected, if at all, by Hurricane Florence. That doesn't mean it didn't put a scare into them. And then we have Hurricane Michael, which had a very different track. It approached the United States through the Gulf of Mexico, made landfall in Florida, Mexico Beach, Florida, and then took a trajectory up through central North Carolina before it went off the coast just north of North Carolina in near the Virginia coast. And the rainfall here was much less than the other two. Lumberton had a 72-hour rainfall of about 80 millimeters, and Windsor had a rainfall, 72-hour rainfall of about 100 millimeters. Excuse me. So that gives you a sense of the events and how they tracked. Let me put the political context or the policy context into this mix so that you can understand the significance of these events and how the actions that were taken ultimately affected it. So once a event occurs, if it is deemed to be sufficiently damaging to exceed the ability of the local government and the state government to manage the extent of the damages, then a presidential disaster declaration is issued. Once a presidential disaster declaration is issued, that makes available public assistance, which goes to communities, counties, communities, for infrastructure redevelopment. And then individual assistance can be available, and that goes to individuals to, as it's called, individual assistance, to help with recovering their losses. Again, this is federal emergency management assistance, so it is assistance just to get people back on their feet, not to make them whole again, so to speak, but it is to help them get over the emergency before other things like insurance and other state policies take effect. So that's one area. The United States also has a national flood insurance program, which requires floodplain zoning. Every community in the United States, it's more than 20,000 communities in the United States that have been documented to be at risk to flooding, have floodplain maps that indicate the 100-year floodplain or the 1% floodplain and the 500-year floodplain or the 0.2% floodplain. Once those areas are mapped, the communities must put regulations, building regulations or floodplain zoning in place. And if any development is going to occur in the 100-year floodplain, then it must be elevated above the base flood elevation, typically 1 foot above the base flood elevation. So, and certain buildings can't be built there. And the only allowable uses in the 100-year floodplain without floodproofing or elevation is agriculture and recreation. And then finally, FEMA requires every community to have a hazard mitigation plan. And that hazard mitigation plan is an all hazard mitigation plan. It doesn't just address floods, but it addresses all hazards. And among the elements in a hazard mitigation plan are the opportunities for and the processes for acquiring properties following events. So you can see that the state of North Carolina overall has a hazard mitigation plan, and then they can be done regionally. So the hazard mitigation plan in the upper right of the diagram is a 5-community hazard mitigation plan, and one of those is the county of Bertie County, which is where Windsor is located. Lumberton, I believe, has its own hazard mitigation plan, the village of Lumberton. So I think that this gives you the political context in which events occur and the opportunities for minimizing flood risk overall. So here are the disaster declaration maps for each of the events. The pink area indicates those counties that were given individual and public assistance, which is the most assistance that can be given. And then the tan areas or yellow areas are those that got public assistance, and there are varying levels of public assistance. But I think one of the things that these maps show is the spatial extent of significant damages from each event. So Hurricane Matthew covered entire half of North Carolina, from the Piedmont all the way through to the coastal plain and to coastal areas. Hurricane Florence, because it went off the coast farther south than did Hurricane Matthew, you can see that part of the fewer counties were given individual and public assistance. And then you can see a number of counties that were given the lower level of individual and public assistance, and then those that just received public assistance. And then finally, Hurricane Michael, the 2 counties that are that represent Lumberton and Windsor, Robertson County, which is in the southern part of the county of the state on the South Carolina border, and Bertie County, which is in northeastern North Carolina, did not receive any assistance at all during Hurricane Michael. You'll notice, though, Bertie County in Hurricane Florence, Bertie County did get some public assistance. And So there was some damage from that. And we'll go through each community and the examples and their experiences. And you might wonder why I included Hurricane Michael. It came right on the heels of Hurricane Florence. Warnings were for large areas of North Carolina. And so all of the counties in eastern North Carolina were fearful that Michael could have significant impacts. And those impacts would have happened a month after Florence, which was devastating to eastern North Carolina. Some communities have yet to recover, Lumberton being one of them. So here is Lumberton for Hurricane Matthew and Florence. So at Matthew, the river peaked at about 6.5 meters. For Florence, it peaked a bit higher. And you can see that Michael was just over flood stage, but had very little impact. Matthew, you can see flooding from Matthew in the upper left. One of the problems with Matthew was that it breached a levee. So Lumberton has levees around it. Windsor does not, and that's an issue with flooding for both communities. And then you can see the flooding from Hurricane Florence a few days after Florence hit. And again, Lumberton had not yet recovered from Matthew, and I'll get into that in a little while, when Florence hit. So in the upper left, you can see a Google Maps or Google Earth view of city of Lumberton. And in the upper right is the flood insurance rate map. So the blue area, the hatched blue area, is the floodway where no development is allowed, although you'll see later there are some buildings there, pre-existing buildings. The blue area is the 100-year floodplain. And the yellow area, where there's very little of it, is the 0.2% floodplain. The brown area, the hatched brown area, is that area that is protected by levees, or, as we found out, supposedly protected by levees. And then in the lower left diagram or map, you can see the area that was flooded by Matthew. And the floodplain map is a good representation of that. Let's look a little bit at the situation in Lumberton. Lumberton lost a little bit of population between 2010 and 2017. My guess is when the new census starts next year, we're going to find that Lumberton has lost even more population, and we'll get into why. The median household income, you can see in the upper right table that Lumberton is less well off than the state as a whole, and the state as a whole is less well off than the United States. Lumberton has a very diverse population, where just under 20% is white or Caucasian, and 38% is white, but only 20% of that is in poverty. You can see that about 37% of the population is African American, but 47% of those African Americans live in poverty. And about 13% of the population is Native American. The Lumbee tribe lives in that region. And 43% of those are in poverty. And then you can see again that the Hispanic population is small, but again, a large proportion of that population lives in poverty. So while overall the poverty rate of Lumberton is about 35%, that just over a third of the population is in poverty, that poverty is not evenly distributed among all populations, with the white population being particularly better off than any of the non-white populations. So that gives us a little sense of what Lumberton is like. So as a result of Matthew, the impacts of Matthew were about 870 households were flooded. Importantly, public facilities, some important infrastructure was damaged, like the water treatment plant, the sewer lift station, electric utilities, and the fire station. So there was a lot of emergency management or emergency response that was unable to be available. Given the poverty rates, it's not surprising that there are a number of public housing developments in the community, and 5 of those public housing developments were flooded, which accounts for 545 units. So out of the 870 households that were flooded, clearly a large percent were those who are less well off. And the water treatment plant was not only damaged, but it was completely inoperable for 10 days, which makes recovery, bringing people back to the community after they've evacuated and being able to manage the damage and clean up, very difficult. So immediately after Matthew, that policy window opened, and people, the policy, local government officials, whether it was Lumberton City or the county, with the assistance of the state and others, as we'll see, came up with plans to modify infrastructure. They wanted to repair the floodgates and modify the levees. One of the issues with stormwater capacity was insufficient, so it wasn't just the flooding from the levee breaks, but it was impossible to get stormwater out of the town, so that the flooding was even more damaging. And one of the other responses was to relocate substantially damaged critical facilities like electric utilities and emergency operations facilities. They chose to maximize hazard mitigation techniques with respect to housing, and we'll see how they were looking at that. And there's a plan to update the land use plan to incorporate hazard mitigation, to incorporate disaster recovery elements, and to participate in what's called the Community Rating System program. FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, gives communities points for undertaking activities that will reduce their flood damages. So increasing stormwater capacity, for instance, putting in culverts, putting in building specifications that are requiring building specifications that exceed those required by the federal government, earns each community points. And with those points, the residents and businesses in the community get a reduction in their flood insurance rates. So there's a lot of opportunity there's a lot of incentive for the community to incorporate these kinds of flood mitigation activities, including public awareness. That's a part of it, and points could be received for that. So to give you an idea of maximizing the hazard mitigation techniques with housing, here was the recovery plan that came out in October 2018. And please pay attention to that date, because that was the same month in which Florence hit Lumberton. And so the plan was to elevate or buy out the structures that you see in the red structures that you see in these maps. So throughout the community, the idea was we're either going to elevate these above the base flood elevation because they weren't previously elevated, or to buy them out completely and have people move elsewhere. So as they were cleaning up for Matthew, Florence hit. Florence created about $14 million in damages, and remember, the wealth of that community is not high. The emergency levee failed. Previously, the permanent, if you will, levee failed. Now the emergency levee failed. More than 500 structures were damaged. And the infrastructure that had been damaged in Matthew had not yet been repaired or fortified, so it was damaged again. And some house repairs were not yet completed after Matthew, and that's in large part because, as you can see here, the relief funds had not been fully allocated. Not only was this a problem because of the timing, but between Matthew and Florence was a state election for governor. And the governor at the time of Matthew was of one political party. The governor after Matthew was of the opposite political party. And so all the plans that had been put in place, or many of the plans that had been put in place by the previous administration, had to be reviewed by the new administration. And so communities like Lumberton fell through the cracks as that happened. So the relief funds had not been fully allocated when the leadership of the state changed, and that set things back even farther. And then Florence hit. So that left Lumberton in a very precarious situation, and the city has not yet recovered from Florence. Recovery is still going on. And then Michael. Then there were fears of Michael. So here's the track of Michael. As you can see from the first headline, Michael, a breeze for Robeson. Now, Robeson is the county in which Lumberton is located. But note the previous ones. In saturated Lumberton, worries about the next storm. Homeowners in Robeson County worry about Hurricane Michael effects. So this was a wake-up call that things had to get done, and we had to get done quickly because it was only a matter of time before there was another hurricane. In 2 months, we'll be moving into the next hurricane season in North America, so we will see what happens with that. But part of the state, the western part of the state, was affected by Michael, as you saw on the disaster declaration maps. So that's Lumberton's situation. We'll come back to it later on, but let's move to Windsor. Windsor, I hadn't mentioned Julia earlier. Julia was a tropical storm that affected Windsor in September of 2016, and Julia topped out at about, the peak stage was about a little over 4 meters. And you can see the flooding from Julia in the village of Windsor. And then a month later or so, Matthew hit, and that topped out at maybe 5 meters. And you can see the flooding from Matthew there. And note that Florence didn't even come close to the flood stage. That doesn't mean there wasn't a scare about it. There certainly was, but it didn't come close. So again, upper left is the Google Earth view of Windsor, a much smaller community, and I'll talk about that. The flood map is on the right. It's a different type of view of the flood map, but you can see the 1% floodplain is in blue, and the 0.2% floodplain, or the 500-year floodplain, is in yellow. And then the bottom map shows the flood. It's a scenario of how the extent of Matthew, and you can see a lot of the area that was flooded is not developed at all, but what was flooded was largely the commercial district. So this is a scenario, but it's pretty close to exactly what happened with respect to Matthew. So the commercial district was severely inundated by Matthew, and so let's look at the situation in Windsor. As I said, it's a much smaller community. It too lost some population following between 2010 and 2017. We can't necessarily attribute that to Julia or Matthew, but and again, my guess is that there will be a greater, even more loss by the 2020 census. Windsor has a lower median household income than, again, North Carolina or the United States, and than Lumberton. And the population is less diverse than Lumberton, with almost 63% of the population being of African American origin. And the white population is about the other third, with a very small Hispanic population. And you can see that, again, the wealth is distributed unequally, with most of the African American population living under the poverty level compared to the white or Hispanic populations. So again, we have very vulnerable populations in very vulnerable locations. So let's look at some impacts. Now remember, this is a much smaller community with just 3,000 people compared to the 20-some thousand. 60 homes were damaged, 42 businesses were damaged, and those businesses were flooded to approximately 2 meters. So there was great damage to the business district, which has created real problems for a community. The Utility Operations Center was heavily damaged, so again, we see infrastructure being damaged, which explains the public assistance that was allocated during the presidential disaster declarations. But you can see that pretty much all of the water, sewer, power, sanitation were all heavily damaged by Matthew in Windsor, and there was also major damage to wastewater lift stations. This is a very flat area, and so there have to be lift stations everywhere in both Lumberton and Windsor. The community center was flooded, which is problematic because it is the community center where many of the community activities, including the Emergency Operations Office, exist. And it's a very small community, but it does have a small zoo, which is a main tourist attraction, and that was significantly flooded. A couple of the animals were roaming the streets after the flood. It wasn't any danger to anybody. It caught the media, who thought that it was kind of funny that these animals were walking around in this very, very small community. But it did bring attention to Windsor's situation. So responses, the community, again, that policy window opened. The community targeted specific buildings for buyouts. But unfortunately, because of the size of Windsor and the spatial extent of damages from Matthew, Windsor was a very low priority in the state. The city, however, or the town, I hardly call it a city, the town decided that instead of following the federal regulations of 1/3 of a meter elevation above base flood, houses having to be elevated 1/3 of a meter above base flood elevation, they changed it to a meter. So any new development or any repairs to any development have to elevate a meter, which is something that the community actually implemented. They chose to relocate 2 county-owned buildings, and again, the emergency management facility, and we're looking to do stormwater improvements. However, it's a very incremental approach. They're still trying to get funding for the buyouts, for the targeted buyouts, and for the buildings to be elevated. That's already been done. But the commercial district is really problematic because to relocate the commercial district changes the nature of the community completely. There is a bypass, a highway bypass that goes, as by its definition, past Windsor but not through Windsor. And that changed part of the community as well because some of the businesses were not doing very well to start with, and then the flood hit. And this is a very historic district, so trying to address the historic preservation aspect of it along with the floodplain aspect of it is particularly problematic. And just to give you an idea of the damages to the overall damage to the business district, so we have 2 restaurants, and these are the 2 restaurants in Windsor. The one in the upper right, Hammerheads, closed and it has chosen not to reopen. Buns Barbecue reopened a month later. Buns is a local, everybody goes to Buns, and I think everybody pitched in to help reopen Buns Barbecue. It's well known regionally, not just in Windsor. So there was a lot of pressure for Buns to reopen, and they did so pretty quickly despite how high the water is. Hammerheads was already on the edge economically and just decided that they couldn't reopen. And then there was Florence. They escaped the worst of the storm, but it did bring, as it says here, the highest sense of urgency. And particularly because the infrastructure had not yet been repaired or fortified. So they were really worried about Florence and whether or not it was going to be able to, they were going to be able to withstand the impacts of that event. And many repairs and initiatives had not yet been completed, and for the same reasons, because of the change in administrations in the state. And then Michael. Headlines for Michael, here we go again. There are other headlines, but I think that gives you enough. And actually, Michael did affect Bertie County. If you can see the track of Michael in the lower right, Bertie County is in northeastern North Carolina, and while Lumberton dodged the bullet, and the town of Windsor dodged the bullet, the county did not, and it's a very agricultural county with specializing in peanuts. And so there was agricultural disaster assistance, which was provided following the event, provided to farmers because of all the damage to their fields as a result of the event. So 2 communities, 3 events, but really 2 events, Florence and Matthew, very different experiences. So let's look at Lumberton versus Windsor, if you will. So let's look at some similarities. Both have very high socioeconomic vulnerability, partly because of the racial and ethnic makeup of the community, but also because of the income levels in the community. Both had critical infrastructure damage, which has taken a very long time to repair, and in Lumberton, it's not yet repaired following Florence. Both had repeat flooding while still recovering, so Lumberton had Florence on top of Matthew, Windsor had Matthew on top of Julia, and in both cases, neither had recovered. And in both cases, there was very slow government response, and so what happened was that private grants and universities stepped in to help move the process along. So the documents that you see, the images that you see here are documents that were produced by private grants and by university groups, particularly the Coastal Resilience Center at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, to help with resilient redevelopment and to come up with recovery plans for both communities. So again, the slow government response was so slow, and part of it, again, has to do with the change in administrations. Not all of it, but part of it. Part of it also has to do with how severe the damage was and how widespread it was in each community and across eastern North Carolina in both cases, for both Florence and Matthew. And it's hard to focus on individual communities when you have many, many communities experiencing significant damage. And Lumberton didn't get it the worst in Florence. Other communities closer to the coast did. Differences are their flood histories. Matthew and Florence in Lumberton, and Julia and Matthew in Windsor. Flood control, or control the flooding. So Lumberton has relied on flood control with levees and floodgates, and Windsor has taken a different approach to control the flooding by elevating structures even higher than what is required by the federal government. Community size, obviously, 3,000 versus 21,000. Something about the available, the resources that are available, the size of local government, things like that, that influence the ability to recover. Demographic composition, the Windsor is dominantly African American, while Lumberton is much more diverse, and I think that may have had some impact on recovery in both cases. And the land use mostly affected. So in Lumberton, it was mostly residential. Yes, obviously some commercial businesses were affected, were flooded, but in Windsor, it was dominantly commercial, and it was most of the central business district, which makes it very difficult for communities to recover. So let's look back at this diagram by Birkeland, and you'll note that I added something in the lower left. New policies can be adopted, but the question is whether or not they're implemented. So if they're implemented, then we have this possible instrumental or social learning, which can help us go back into accumulated experience from prior events and for future events. But what if they're not implemented? And in the case of both Windsor and Lumberton, all of the activities that they had intended to undertake were not completed by the time, had not been implemented. And again, part of it was because the events happened so quickly on top of one another, compared to the complexity of what needed to be done. But adopting policies is one thing, implementing them before the next event is another, and time really does matter. So in conclusion, what lessons were learned from these with respect to resilience? The National Flood Insurance Program is effective in reducing losses in some places, particularly in Windsor, where they have been very proactive in elevating structures. But again, the experiences vary. The area that was protected by the levee, for instance, is not in the floodplain where those regulations apply. The regulations for floodplain zoning and building elevations apply. And so when the levee broke, those structures in that area were damaged, yet did not have to follow some of the regulations. Time clearly matters. I don't think that that's any great rocket science kind of conclusion, but time matters in that it's critical in places which are very vulnerable physically to get things moving as quickly as possible. And we can't underestimate the importance of public-private partnerships for communities that are under-resourced. They tend to fall low on the priority scale when it comes to state priorities for recovery because they're small, they're poorer, and in many cases, the money that's available at certain times has to go somewhere, and often we want to get that money to the larger communities that can help serve the smaller communities later on. So those public-private partnerships are critical for under-resourced communities, and perhaps we need to get those organized before the next event. Lessons to be learned. I have really the most important lesson, I think, and this is becoming my mantra in life, is that planning for floods of the past doesn't work. So Lumberton was rebuilding the levee to previous flood heights, and the emergency levee that was built to the previous flood height didn't work. And given the fact of where these communities are in North Carolina, and projections for precipitation in eastern North Carolina or in the southeast United States are for there to be the same amount of rainfall, but it's going to come down in intense events. So we're likely to see more events with very high 1 day or 2 or 3 day precipitation amounts. And so we need to think about that when we plan for future floods. So the challenges I think that exist are the local political will versus the resource base. Both Lumberton and Windsor had the political will, that policy window opened, and groups mobilized, decisions were made. They didn't have the resource base to carry it out, and they needed a great deal of assistance. And I think the other one is recognizing the criticality of commercial land uses to building resilience. Windsor, I don't think, will ever be resilient without as a community, without its central business district, and the whole idea and how to rebuild that or to move it in large part so that the community can still have a central business district and survive as a community is a very complex and difficult process to follow. And so I think without that commercial land use, the community is not going to be resilient, and without rebuilding, without a population in Lumberton, if people keep moving out or are moving out because of the repeat flooding, then you're not going to have a resilient community because likely you won't have a community. I don't want to end on a bad note, a down note. I really think that both communities are doing the best they can, and those public-private partnerships have been really important to helping them develop resilience. And these partnerships involve everything from engineers to landscape architects to land use planners, to sort of address all of the issues that these communities are facing and to help with how buildings should be rebuilt and where they should be rebuilt. So with that, here are the references that I used. And with that, take any questions that might come up if there's time.
Thank you very much, Burrell. That was an excellent presentation, quite an eye-opener, I guess. Because most of people have the perception that when it happens in the US, it's a developed nation, so it's easy to, respond, and everybody gets similar kind of help. Government comes in and helps everybody in the same manner. So obviously that's not the case. And actually, you ended in a very the words that you used, public-private partnership, actually, this is the second time we are hearing this word. Since morning, when Faith did his presentation.
We didn't plan it.
Yeah. So
we did not plan that.
Okay. All right. I'm sure you did. He also mentioned that how important. Sorry? Oh, okay. Burrell, could you just stop sharing, and we would like to see you now. Yeah.
How do I do that?
You can just, there must be something called stop sharing.
There might be. Oh, wait.
Just take your, move your mouse on. Yes, there you go.
Okay.
Thank you. So yes, I guess public-private partnership is coming out to be one of the key words for the day, word of the day. And another thing you mentioned, that planning based on past floods do not work. I would say memories do work, but planning based on past flood events, understanding them, and having climate change into the system, understanding how those past events can change in future, and then planning based on that might be more effective.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Can I clarify a little bit? A lot of for instance, our regulations are based on the 100-year floodplain.
Yeah.
And that 100-year floodplain is based on, if we even have it, past floods, the past 100 years, and that's what the models are based on.
Yes.
And so the idea is, my point was, let's think about, okay, that's what we know happened in the past, let's think about the future. And the town of Windsor has done that by having that higher base flood elevation.
Yes, yeah. I think that's another very good point you made, is the political will and the resource base around it. And I think we are quite aware, it's not only in the US, it's happening everywhere.
Right.
All developing nations are facing, well, all nations basically are facing the same problems. And the problem is more difficult, especially in poor regions, as you have seen the comparison between the case studies she has showed us. So when now, because I'm talking mostly to engineers here, I would I would request actually, when you are modeling, when you are thinking about models, think about the society as well. So you always have to bring that human aspect in, and also look at the political context, look at the policies. It's not only modeling, but also understanding what policies are existing and how it can affect the models that you are building. So because most of the time we are predicting future scenarios. So if you understand what policies are existing, it might be useful to incorporate into your model to think if this policy is working, or if the changes have been made, what will be the outcome? And if it hasn't been made, as she has shown in her lovely flow chart, what could be the result in the near or in the future? So I think this is very similar situation in Brazil. And also something, it's a very, I'm sorry, I'm talking quite a lot. I will give the floor to you to ask questions, but this is something very close to my heart. I work with things around that, so no, you know, when I start talking. So yes, okay. So I will give the floor to you, and if you have questions, maybe from another perspective, I'm sure you will have. I'm a social scientist, so most probably it would be nice to hear questions coming from the engineers. How do you feel? How do you think about this particular issue? So the floor is yours. Yes.
Yeah. Good afternoon, Professor. My name is Cesar. I have a question about public-private partnerships. Because for me, here in Brazil, we don't have hurricanes, so it's hard to imagine. We can only imagine, but we don't really know what happened, what people really feel. So I want to know some examples of public-private partnerships that can be used or made to help people, to help under-resourced communities, because they are those ones who suffer the most.
Sure. First of all, I understand you don't have hurricanes, but most of the damage from the hurricanes that I was talking about all comes from flooding. And these communities flood even without hurricanes. They're just really unlucky, or in really bad locations, or both. But so public-private partnerships, we have some, as I said, the universities can be very helpful in this. And yes, some of the universities are public. Most of the universities that worked with them are public, but it's not government. So maybe I would say university/government partnerships. That's very helpful. And then we frequently work with foundations, companies that are in the communities or near the communities, companies that draw their employees from those communities, and often they will help with funding studies, or funding some repairs to get things rolling a little bit faster. A lot of the partnerships, though, are really funding studies so that we can figure out what needs to be done, and then looking to the government for funding for infrastructure, for instance, or any land use plans. So that's what I would recommend. And I might also add that one of the plans that was shown, one of the mitigation plans that was shown, the regional one, was done by a consulting firm. A private consulting firm that works with the town of Windsor, because they don't have their own planners. They hire, instead of paying their own employees, they get consultants to do some of the land use planning. And so that too is a public-private partnership that I would focus on.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yeah.
Thank you. Mario Mendiondo from Brazil. In terms of the Brazilian context, we have thousands of risk-prone areas, mostly affected by landslides, flooding, flash floods. yearly several people died in South America related to these subtropical conditions. The figures are increasing for the next decades. So my question is, if the drivers of risk exposure show that the numbers are going to increase risk exposure, and the public policy is not enough to attain the citizenship, how can convince the private companies that dealing with risk exposure in these areas could be a profitable business from one side? Because in the academy, usually we have the problem to be mitigated, but not to, say, educate in terms of risk transfer, in terms of creating new opportunities for insurance, or especially in South America. So what's your opinion or tips for these latitudes that we have, because we have different experience related to the North American case? Thank you.
I wish I had an answer for you. We do have very different flooding. We have many of the same problems that you do. I mean, I'm just focusing on eastern North Carolina, which is very flat and has hurricanes, and that's where I live right now, so that's what I'm focused on. But, you know, I have a colleague in my department who works on debris flows, and particularly debris flows after a wildfire, which then, once it starts raining, causes landslides, bigger debris flows, things like that. So we've had a lot of experience with that. I think that I don't think that the private sector is going to do it all. I don't think they can do a lot of it, but we did have, in the United States, we did have under FEMA at one point a program called Project Impact that was businesses working with local governments to minimize or to work together to lessen the vulnerability of the communities and make them more resilient. Unfortunately, that fell apart when a new president took over, not our current one. I'll just leave that at that. But I think you might look at, I'm sure if you looked up Project Impact under FEMA, there will be some guidance on that. And that was a really effective, a lot of communities, some communities, particularly in Florida, for instance, took advantage of it. I don't think it lasted long enough to show how effective it could be, but it was a very effective public-private partnership that existed. And I think that maybe that's one way to look at it and see what lessons can be drawn from the successes of Project Impact.
That's a very good example. Yeah, I think that's a very useful example. I have a quick question as well about it's about commercial properties, as no one is asking questions on that. I thought I will ask one, because often as we see, it's commercial properties are ignored in research. We focus more on residential properties. So in your opinion, what do you think about the risk-absorbing attitude in such small communities in terms of insurance or things like that? It's actually coming from Professor Mario's question as well. So smaller communities, smaller businesses, SMEs, how do they, what is their perception of risk absorbing?
Well, commercial insurance is available through the National Flood Insurance Program. And I don't know how many of the businesses in Windsor had that insurance, because it's not cheap. But it isn't cheap it is inexpensive compared to the risk that they face. They face very high risk. Yeah. One of the problems too is whether or not they own the building or they're renting the building. And in some cases, because they're historic structures, the businesses that are there actually don't own the building. And somebody else does, and so they would have to have the insurance, not the business itself. And so I don't know how that actually works. And, you know, again, these businesses are also really on the edge of being successful in a community like Windsor. And so any shock to it like this and particularly 2 floods in a row, Julia and Matthew, were too much for some of the businesses. And once you lose the central business district, however small it may be, you really lose the core of the town in a place like Windsor. So, insurance is available, but again, I think particularly given the risk, insurance is going to be high, and the question is the owner-renter relationship. And I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, I think that's a very similar situation in the United Kingdom, which is also okay. The absorbing capacity we saw is that they would rather absorb smaller risks, but when it comes to bigger risks, then insurance is the only way. And often they have to pay very high premium for that.
And while they can get, in the United States, while they can get some disaster assistance, it often isn't enough to help with and they get lower priority. The federal government wants to get residences back faster than businesses, even though there's a direct relationship.
Yeah. Well, one last question. You mentioned the zoo was flooded. I hope there were no lions on the road.
No, there were no lions on the road.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure.
No, it was I can't even remember what it was. It was like an elk or something that was walking around. But it caught national media.
Yeah, well, good news, at least something.
Yeah, nobody was in danger. No.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you so much, Burrell. Anyone else has any more questions for Burrell? Okay.
Questions after the
Yes. Yeah. Okay, so Burrell, we have your email, and if anyone has any more questions, I will forward them to you, or they can just write to you directly.
Email me directly. That's great. Happy to answer any questions.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Burrell. That was an excellent presentation. Thank you for joining us. Shall we give her another round of applause, please?
And thank you all. It's been a treat. I enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.